I should have known that silence can reveal more than words, and that laughter, the wrong kind of laughter, is capable of cutting deeper than any shouted insult. We were sitting together in his apartment, a place that had always felt like a shared territory, though I had begun to sense lately that the walls were more his than ours. It was an ordinary evening. Nothing dramatic, no candles, no wine, just the two of us on the couch with the television playing something in the background we weren't even watching. I had been thinking about the future, about where we were going, and in that quiet moment, with his hand resting loosely on my knee, I said it almost casually. "Have you ever thought about us getting married?" I didn't ask it as a demand, nor as a plea. It was a natural question, an opening of the heart, as if inviting him into a conversation about where love leads. What I got in return wasn't conversation, wasn't tenderness, wasn't even hesitation. He laughed. Not the kind of laugh that bubbles up out of nervousness, not the awkward kind that betrays surprise. This laugh was sharp, dismissive, and cruel, the kind of laugh that strips you naked in a second and leaves you cold. It wasn't loud, but it was pointed, deliberate. He tilted his head back slightly and chuckled in a way that told me everything. Marriage, the life I imagined with him, the possibility of a shared future. It was all a joke to him, something laughable. My lips froze into a half-smile that I didn't mean, the instinctive mask of someone trying not to show how deeply they've just been wounded. His eyes never softened, not even to apologize or backtrack. If anything, the smirk lingered, as if my question had confirmed his superiority, his assumption that I was more invested than he ever would be. The television flickered in the background, voices droning, while inside me something shifted irreversibly. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't press. I simply tucked the moment away like a shard of glass. 15 seconds of laughter had done what months of subtle distance and evasive answers had only hinted at. They told me I was standing alone in something I thought was shared. He tried to change the subject quickly, speaking about something at work, something meaningless, and I nodded at the right moments, my face calm. But beneath the calm, the wound was cauterizing into something else, something colder. It was in that instant that I understood the balance of our relationship had been an illusion. He had never seen me as an equal, not as someone whose dreams mattered. To him, I was amusement, convenience, a chapter without permanence. The man who laughed at marriage was not only laughing at the institution, he was laughing at me, at my place in his life, at the idea that I could be worth the commitment he reserved for no one. I went home that night and looked around my own apartment differently. The pictures on the walls, the clothes folded neatly in drawers, the toothbrush beside mine in the bathroom, they all seemed like props in a play where I hadn't been given the script. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying that laugh over and over until it no longer sounded like humor, but like cruelty in its purest form. Yet as the hours stretched into dawn, the pain settled into clarity. I didn't feel hysteria. I didn't feel desperation. I felt the clarity of someone who has just been handed the truth, unvarnished and undeniable. He wasn't mine. He had never really been mine. And if he thought I would crumble, if he thought that his laugh had placed me beneath him, he had no idea who he was dealing with. What struck me most wasn't just the rejection, but the arrogance of it. That someone could look at another human being who had given time, loyalty, and love, and dismiss all of it with a laugh. That was what burned in me. Not the loss of him, but the insult to my worth. I realized then that I would not beg for an explanation, nor would I sink into the role of the wounded partner. No, I would watch. I would wait, and I would see what truth that laugh was hiding, because no one laughs that way unless they're covering something. His cruelty was a mask, and somewhere beneath it, there was weakness, a fault line. I only needed to find it. As I rose the next morning and prepared myself for the day, my reflection in the mirror no longer looked naive. The girl who asked about marriage out of love was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been shown, in one brutal instant, the measure of the man she was with. And instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. He thought it was over in that laugh, that I would retreat or accept it. But what he didn't know was that he had given me the first piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. Something in his reaction told me this wasn't just about disinterest. There was something more, a secret, or a fear, something he didn't want exposed. That laugh had been too loud, too mocking, too intentional, and I was going to find out why. I carried on as if nothing had happened, answering his texts with the same warmth as before, listening to his stories, letting him think that my silence meant acceptance. But beneath it all, the memory of that laugh was an ember glowing hotter with every passing day. I knew what he had set in motion, though he had no idea. He thought he had won some unspoken game. What he had really done was awaken in me the will to see just how fragile his arrogance was, and how easily it could all come undone. The days that followed his laugh felt strangely heavy, as though the air itself had thickened, making each ordinary movement carry a weight it hadn't before. He believed, I think, that his reaction had silenced me, that I would retreat into the quiet acceptance of someone who had overreached and learned her place. But he was wrong. If anything, his laughter had tuned my senses sharper, like an instrument suddenly brought into perfect pitch. Every word, every gesture, every absence began to reveal more than I had ever bothered to notice. The seeds of doubt were not planted in a moment of paranoia. They had always been there, dormant beneath the surface of our relationship, and his mockery was only the rain that made them sprout. I started to watch him differently, not with the trusting eyes of someone in love, but with the detached calculation of someone who has seen behind the curtain and knows there is something hidden. At first it was small things, the kind of details you could easily dismiss if you wanted to preserve your peace. The way he kept his phone face down on the table, always within reach, always shielded from my view. The way he stepped outside to take calls he claimed were just work, even at hours when no office was awake. The sudden silences when I entered the room, the pauses too long to be coincidence, the screens that closed with a quick swipe of his hand. I had ignored these things before, or rather, I had absorbed them into the gentle narrative of trust. Now they stood out like cracks in glass, impossible to ignore, each one catching the light of suspicion until the whole surface seemed ready to shatter. The seeds grew faster the more I let my mind wander back through our past. His reluctance to introduce me to certain friends, the way he always avoided talking about the future in concrete terms, the slight irritation in his voice when I asked about his family. None of it was glaring at the time, but memory is a cruel teacher once you know what to look for. It paints everything with the clarity of hindsight, showing you the patterns you swore weren't there. I realized how often he had mocked things that mattered to me, my goals, my career ambitions, my opinions, disguising it all as humor. And now that I understood the kind of laugh he was capable of, those smaller jabs seemed to belong to the same family, all part of the same quiet contempt. What unsettled me most was not the idea that he might have someone else. That possibility, painful as it was, would at least have been simple. What gnawed at me was the sense that his laughter had been a defense mechanism, that he had something to lose if the topic of marriage ever became real. It was as though the question itself had touched a nerve he couldn't afford to expose, and so he buried it under ridicule. That realization shifted everything. It meant there was more at stake than just the future of our relationship. There was a truth he was protecting, and if he was willing to wound me so carelessly to keep it hidden, then whatever it was must be dangerous to him. So I played along. I let him believe the moment had passed, that I had accepted his dismissal. I laughed at his jokes. I let him touch me. I let him believe he still held control. But beneath the surface, I began to collect. Not things you could hold in your hand, but things that live in the corners of your awareness. The receipts that didn't match the stories, the messages that arrived too late to be casual, the sudden excuses that never had enough detail. I learned the rhythm of his lies the way you learn the rhythm of a song. Once you recognize the beat, you can hear it everywhere. One evening, he said he was working late, and I decided not to text him, not to ask for updates. Instead, I let the silence stretch and watched how he filled it. He didn't come home until after midnight, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, and though he thought I was asleep, I noted the careful way he crept into the room, removing his jacket as though afraid the sound might wake me. I didn't move. I let him think I hadn't noticed. But in the stillness of the night, my mind carved the truth deeper into itself. His laugh had been more than dismissal. It had been the signal of a man who feared exposure. With each passing day, the doubt became less like suspicion and more like knowledge. It wasn't about whether he was hiding something anymore. It was about when I would discover what it was. And though the thought of betrayal should have filled me with grief, what I felt instead was a strange kind of power. He had underestimated me. He had assumed his laugh would reduce me to silence, that his arrogance would blind me. But in truth, it had awakened something steadier than love, stronger than heartbreak. It had awakened the resolve to know, to see, and eventually, to act. I began to notice how his eyes flickered when I asked harmless questions, how his body stiffened when certain names were mentioned, how quick he was to mock or change the subject when the conversation strayed too close to things he didn't want discussed. I became fluent in the language of his deflections, and each time I decoded one, I felt less like his partner and more like his shadow, silently watching, quietly waiting. It was no longer a matter of if his world would unravel, but when, and whether I would be the one to pull the thread. The seeds of doubt had become something else entirely by then. They were no longer just doubts. They were roots, digging deep into the soil of my mind, anchoring me to the reality I had tried for so long not to see. His laugh had been the spark, but my silence was the storm he didn't know was gathering. And as I moved through the days with calm precision, smiling when he looked at me, nodding when he spoke, I knew he had no idea how close he was to being caught in the collapse of the life he thought he controlled. Doubt, once it takes root, does not stop growing. It winds itself around every thought, stretches its tendrils into memory, and suddenly, even the moments you once believed were solid begin to look fragile. I had reached that stage where I no longer questioned whether something was wrong. I only questioned how deeply the wrongness ran. And when you live in that state, small details become revelations. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, not the kind that comes with shouting or confrontation. The truth began to unfold in pieces, like a letter pulled from an envelope one careful inch at a time. And the first inch revealed itself on a Thursday evening when he claimed he had to leave town for a last-minute business trip. He told me with the casual confidence of someone who believes they are untouchable, his tone light, his explanation rehearsed, almost lazy. A conference, he said. Meetings he couldn't miss. He waved his hand as if the details didn't matter. And perhaps to him they didn't. But to me they mattered more than anything. I nodded, asked the right questions without pressing too hard, let him think I had swallowed the story whole. But inside, I had already begun to trace the edges of the lie. I knew his company. I knew their schedule. And I knew that what he had said didn't quite fit. When he left the next morning, suitcase in hand and a smile of practiced ease on his lips, I didn't cry. I didn't cling. I kissed him goodbye as if I were the same woman who had once believed his laugh was harmless, and I let him go with a calm that unsettled even me. The moment the door closed, I opened my laptop and began to dig. It didn't take long. His company's website listed no such conference. His colleagues, at least the ones whose profiles I could access, made no mention of travel. And when I searched his name in connection with the supposed event, nothing appeared. It was as though the conference he described existed only in his imagination. The more I searched, the more the pieces began to shift into place. His email, synced to our shared cloud long ago for convenience, betrayed him with a single careless confirmation. Not a conference, not a meeting, but a reservation. Hotel, dinner, and tickets for a concert 2 cities away. 2 names attached. His and hers. The name was unfamiliar at first, a stranger's signature against the cruel punch of his betrayal. But as I read it again, something stirred at the back of my mind. I had heard it before. Not from him, never from him, but in passing conversations, whispers among mutual acquaintances. A colleague, someone from his office, someone he had once mocked in front of me, dismissing her ambition, her seriousness. And now there it was in black and white, her name alongside his, attached not to business, but to pleasure, hidden beneath a lie so thin, I almost pitied him for thinking it would hold. Almost. But pity has no place once laughter has carved itself into cruelty. I remember sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, the glow of the screen illuminating the truth that could no longer be denied. The betrayal wasn't only personal, it was strategic, deliberate, constructed with the arrogance of someone who thought he could deceive without consequence. And as the realization settled, I felt that same clarity I had felt the night he laughed at me. No tears, no hysterics. Just the steady certainty that his world was beginning to unravel. The hidden truth continued to reveal itself in ways he didn't even notice. His social media, scrubbed clean to the casual eye, still left breadcrumbs for anyone patient enough to follow. A photo posted by a friend, a tagged location he hadn't bothered to remove, the reflection of his watch in the corner of an image that wasn't meant to include him. It was all there, pieces of a puzzle he thought was too complex for me to solve. But arrogance blinds, and arrogance had made him sloppy. What struck me hardest was not just that he was with someone else, it was that the someone else was not free either. A quick search revealed that she was engaged. Her smiling face appeared beside a man who looked at her the way I once thought my boyfriend looked at me, his arm around her waist, his caption filled with love. She wasn't simply an accomplice in betrayal, she was betraying too. The web of deceit stretched further than I had expected, and suddenly the laugh that had once echoed in my mind took on a new meaning. He wasn't just laughing at me, he was laughing at the absurdity of the double life he thought he could maintain. But he had miscalculated, because now, armed with this knowledge, I was no longer simply the betrayed girlfriend. I was the keeper of a secret large enough to destroy more than one life. And though I did not yet know exactly how I would use it, I knew with absolute certainty that I would not remain silent. His hidden truth had unfolded, and with it, the shape of what was to come began to crystallize. I went about my days as though nothing had changed. I texted him the way I always did, wished him good luck on his conference, listened as he told me stories over the phone about meetings that never happened. I smiled when he returned, greeted him with warmth, and let him believe he had fooled me. But inside, the fire burned steady and cold. I had seen what he thought was invisible. I had traced the lines of his deception, and I had marked the path he didn't realize he had laid out for me. The truth had unfolded, not in a single moment, but in layers, each one stripping away the mask he wore until the man I thought I loved stood revealed as a liar, a manipulator, and a coward. And though he did not yet know it, the game had already shifted. His laugh had begun the story, but mine would end it. The night after I discovered the reservation with her name alongside his, I lay awake in the dark with my phone resting on my chest, staring at the ceiling as if the plaster might offer answers. The silence was not empty but alive, humming with a strange electricity, the kind that comes not from panic, but from resolve. Once the hidden truth had been laid bare, I knew the next stage of this story would not be confrontation. That would have been too easy, too obvious, and far too fleeting. What I needed was time, patience, and above all, silence. He thought he was clever, weaving his excuses, whispering into the phone when he thought I wasn't listening, smiling with that same smirk he wore when he laughed at me. Let him keep thinking he had the upper hand. Let him believe I was still the naive woman who once asked about marriage, and was silenced by his cruelty. In silence, I began to prepare. Preparation did not begin with grand gestures. It began with small observations and the discipline of restraint. I studied his schedule as if I were memorizing the moves of an opponent in a chess match. I knew when he left the house, how long he lingered at the gym, which evenings he claimed to be working late. I learned the rhythm of his lies so intimately that I could predict them before they left his mouth. At work, during lunch, during evenings alone, I began to piece together a map of his deception, tracing the outlines of his life with her, and contrasting them against the life he presented to me. Every inconsistency became a thread I tugged at, and the more threads I gathered, the closer I came to weaving a noose of his own making. But I didn't only watch him, I watched her too. The woman whose name had appeared like a ghost in his itinerary was not a stranger anymore. Through fragments online, through pictures and posts and casual mentions, I constructed a portrait of her life. She smiled easily in photographs, the kind of woman who looked comfortable being adored. She wore an engagement ring in every recent picture, the kind of ring that suggested not only commitment, but the trust of a man who loved her deeply. I looked at his face in those photos, the fiancé who had no idea that the woman at his side had already chosen to betray him, and I felt a flicker of kinship with him. He and I were strangers, yet bound by the same wound, inflicted by the same careless hands. He didn't know it yet, but he was already part of the story I was preparing to tell. I collected evidence quietly, saving screenshots, printing confirmations, keeping records tucked away in places he would never look. I rehearsed conversations in my mind, not the ones I would have with him, but the ones I imagined she might have with her fiancé once the truth became undeniable. I imagined the look on her face when the mask she wore in her pictures cracked in front of him. And I imagined the look on his face, my boyfriend's, when he realized that the laugh he once thought had diminished me had only set into motion the careful architecture of his ruin. To the outside world, nothing changed. I was still the same girlfriend who texted him sweet messages, who asked about his day, who kissed him goodbye at the door. I even let him believe he was fooling me with his elaborate fictions about work, about travel, about obligations that never existed. But each time I smiled at him, I was not smiling with love. I was smiling with the cold composure of someone who has already decided how the story will end. Every gesture of affection was camouflage, every nod of agreement a layer of disguise, hiding the storm building beneath my calm exterior. There were moments when the temptation to confront him burned hot in my throat, when I wanted to shout the truth in his face and watch him squirm. But I swallowed it down, because I knew the power of silence. Silence was patience sharpened into a weapon. Silence allowed him to continue weaving his lies while I gathered every strand, storing them like ammunition for the day I would finally strike. He thought my quiet meant defeat, but it was in fact the most dangerous thing I could give him, the space to bury himself deeper. The preparation extended into my own life too. I began to detach pieces of myself from him, invisibly at first, withdrawing financially, emotionally, and socially. I took steps to ensure that when the time came, I would not be the one left ruined. Bank accounts reorganized, personal files protected, boundaries redrawn in ways he couldn't see. He believed he was building a future on the foundation of my trust, but what he didn't realize was that I had already pulled the floorboards from beneath him. Each day that passed, I became stronger in the silence, and each evening he returned home thinking he had succeeded in fooling me. I knew I was closer to the moment when the mask would slip. The image of him laughing at me that night no longer stung the way it had. Instead, it became fuel, a reminder of why patience mattered. I could hear that laugh echoing, but it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me now, reshaped into something sharper, colder, a promise that one day soon it would be him who laughed no more. Preparation is not glamorous. It is long, it is quiet, it is relentless. It is the discipline of waiting when every nerve in your body begs for action. But it is also powerful, because with each passing day, I was no longer simply the betrayed girlfriend. I was the architect of his undoing, drawing blueprints in the shadows while he slept beside me, unaware that every breath he took in peace was a gift from me, a gift that would one day be revoked. And when that day came, when the silence finally broke, he would understand in the most devastating way that the joke he thought he had made at my expense was only the beginning of a tragedy he had written for himself. It is one thing to prepare in silence, to collect the fragments of betrayal like shards of glass, and arrange them into something sharp enough to cut. But it is another thing entirely to realize you are not alone in the gathering storm. Until then, I had believed this was my private war, my quiet calculation against the man who laughed at me, and the woman who wore another man's ring while slipping into a role that was never hers to claim. Yet as I walked further down the path of patience, an unexpected thread connected me to someone I had never imagined would stand at my side. The first contact came not through design, but by accident, or perhaps by inevitability, because lies so tangled always unravel in more than one direction. It happened on a gray afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I did not recognize. The words were cautious, almost hesitant, as though the sender wasn't entirely sure they wanted to press send. "You don't know me, but I think we need to talk about them." No name, no context, just that. For a moment I stared at the screen, suspicion tightening in my chest. It could have been anyone. But then another message followed, this time with an image attached. A photo of him. Not a photo I had taken, but one captured in the wild, blurry around the edges, his hand entwined with hers in a gesture so intimate it made my throat burn. And in that instant, the world tilted slightly and fell into a new alignment. Whoever was sending this was watching them too. We agreed to meet in a quiet cafe away from the city center, the kind of place where no one lingers long enough to notice two strangers sitting across from each other. I arrived early, nerves threading through me like static, and when he walked in, I recognized him immediately from the photos I had seen online. Her fiancé, the man she posed with so proudly, the man she had promised forever while building her empire of lies. His face was pale, his jaw set with the brittle determination of someone forcing themselves not to collapse. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He simply sat down, placed his phone on the table, and began to scroll through a gallery that mirrored my own collection of evidence. Screenshots, messages, confirmations. His hand shook slightly as he swiped, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. So it's true. They're doing this to both of us. There was no comfort in the confirmation, only a strange sense of symmetry, as though we were two pieces of the same broken mirror finally set side by side. We spoke in low tones, the kind that hover just above a whisper, piecing together timelines, comparing notes, stitching their lies into a single tapestry of betrayal. Every detail he shared filled gaps in my own knowledge. Every word I offered widened the cracks in his understanding of her. It was not just that they were unfaithful. It was the extent of their arrogance, the elaborate measures they had taken to weave their double lives, thinking we were too blind to ever notice. And in that cafe, beneath the dim light and the clatter of cups, a pact was formed without ceremony. We would not fight each other. We would not retreat into shame. We would stand, not as strangers, but as allies bound by the same wound. He was quieter than me, more restrained, but there was a heat in his eyes that matched the one I had been carrying silently for weeks. His pain was raw, but beneath it was the same clarity that had begun to steady me. They had underestimated us both, believing they could juggle the illusion forever, but together, we were no longer simply victims of betrayal. We were witnesses, strategists, and soon, executioners of the truth they thought they could bury. After that meeting, everything changed. The silence I had been carrying felt less heavy, because it was shared, and the plan that had lived only in fragments of my imagination began to take shape in the form of collaboration. We exchanged evidence, cross-referenced alibis, filled in the missing hours of their stories. Where my knowledge faltered, his filled the void, and where his certainty wavered, mine offered confirmation. Each discovery tightened the net around them, and each shared glance carried the unspoken agreement that patience would deliver a justice louder than any confrontation ever could. At night, when I returned to my apartment and he returned to his, we would exchange short messages, not of comfort, but of strategy, a forwarded screenshot, a receipt, a photo captured from afar. The lines of communication were not about healing, they were about building. Together we were architects now, drawing up the design of a reckoning that neither of them would see coming. They thought they had chosen each other, but in truth, their choices had chosen us, binding us together in a way far more permanent than the lies of passion they mistook for love. The strangest part was the sense of calm it gave me. For weeks I had lived with the weight of knowledge pressing down on my chest, forcing me into silence that threatened to suffocate. But now that silence had become shared language, I was no longer the only one staring into the abyss of their betrayal. He stood there too, and together we could see clearly where the path would lead. I began to realize that what bound us was not only betrayal, but also dignity. Neither of us wanted to scream or beg. Neither of us would lower ourselves to plead for scraps of explanation. Instead, we wanted them to face themselves, stripped of the illusions they had so carefully constructed. We wanted their laughter, their confidence, their arrogance to rot into desperation before our eyes. And as I lay awake that night, scrolling through the evidence one last time, I understood that the joke was no longer on me. The laugh that had once echoed like cruelty in my ears would soon be drowned out by the sound of their own unraveling. In the stillness of those hours, I thought of how alliances are often born in war, how people who might never have spoken under ordinary circumstances find themselves united against a common enemy. That was what this had become. Not a simple affair, not a personal betrayal, but a battlefield carved out of lies. And in that battlefield, I had found an ally. Unexpected, yes. Unwanted, perhaps, but necessary. And as the days moved forward and the plan began to grow sharper, I knew with unshakable certainty that neither of them had any idea what was coming. The moment we became allies, the silence I had once carried alone transformed into a current that hummed between us, subtle but steady, like the low vibration of a storm still gathering beyond the horizon. No longer was I confined to my own observations and carefully hoarded evidence. Now there was a second pair of eyes, a second set of hands pulling threads from the tangled knot of lies. And when two people wounded in the same way turn their pain outward, what begins as grief becomes strategy. Our first move did not come in a blaze of fury or confrontation. It came with precision, with quiet intent, with the understanding that the most devastating blows are not the loudest, but the ones delivered with surgical accuracy at the moment they are least expected. We spent hours crafting the foundation of what would become our opening strike. Over coffee cups that went cold and under the muted buzz of late-night messages, we mapped out the outlines of their deceit. It was almost clinical in its detail. Dates, times, receipts, photos, alibis that overlapped too neatly not to be suspicious. What had once felt like fragmented observations became a coherent timeline, an unassailable record of betrayal. He had pieces I didn't. I had angles he hadn't considered. And together we built a tapestry so seamless it could suffocate them both. Yet the question remained, how to use it? Do we deliver everything at once, tearing the curtain from their stage in front of the audience they most wanted to impress? Or do we drip it out slowly, letting fear gnaw at them in silence until they imploded under the weight of paranoia? In the end, we chose a beginning that was neither loud nor entirely invisible. We wanted to test them, to remind them that the walls they thought were secure were riddled with cracks. The first move had to be enough to shake them, but not enough to expose us. And so, we created an accident. It was simple, almost elegant in its execution. A single photo, one of those blurry but unmistakable images of them together, delivered without explanation to her fiancé's email address from an anonymous account. No words, no threats, just an image. The kind of image that demanded explanation but offered none. I remember waiting that day with a tension that coiled in my chest like a living thing. He had agreed to let me know as soon as she reacted, and when his message finally came, it was just 3 words. It worked. Panic. She had confronted him, clumsy and defensive, spinning half-truths so transparent they collapsed under the weight of their own implausibility. He described her voice, strained and too high, her eyes darting away when she spoke, the way her fingers twisted the ring she wore as if it might anchor her to something real. He didn't press too hard. That wasn't the point. The point was to plant the first seed of fear, and fear, once sown, spreads like wildfire. That evening, when my boyfriend returned home, I saw the ripple of the same panic on him. He tried to hide it, of course, covering it with exaggerated affection, pressing kisses to my forehead as though reminding me of the role I was supposed to play. But his movements were restless, his phone clutched tighter than usual, his laugh too sharp, too rehearsed. I watched him from across the room, my expression calm, my voice steady, and inside me there was a thrill so sharp it bordered on joy. He knew something was shifting beneath him, even if he couldn't name it yet. The ground was trembling, and he could feel it. The beauty of that first move was in its subtlety. It wasn't enough to expose the entire affair, but it was enough to destabilize them, to force them into mistakes they would otherwise have avoided. They began to scramble, changing their patterns, whispering urgently, creating new lies to patch the old ones. But lies created in panic are never strong. They are flimsy, rushed, transparent, and each one gave us more material, more evidence, more fuel. Their desperation became our weapon. As days passed, the effects of that single strike began to ripple outward. She grew tense, her online presence shifting. Fewer photos with her fiancé, captions that sounded forced. He grew erratic, suddenly eager to spend more time with me, as though afraid of leaving me too long in silence. I let him, of course, smiling when he pulled me close, nodding when he spoke of our future. And all the while I listened carefully to the cracks widening in his voice. The man who once laughed at the very idea of commitment now clung to me as though my belief in him were the last shield he had. It was almost poetic, watching him scramble for the very thing he had mocked, knowing I was already sharpening the blade that would take it away. What made this stage so intoxicating was not just the power of knowing, but the anticipation of what was to come. This was only the first move, a tremor before the earthquake, a whisper before the scream. He had no idea that the game had shifted from love to survival, no idea that every gesture he made was being weighed and catalogued by someone who had already stopped seeing him as a partner and begun to see him as prey. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, his breathing uneven, his phone clutched beneath his pillow as though proximity might protect him from whatever shadow had begun to loom, I stared at the ceiling and felt the calm certainty of someone who has set a plan into motion and knows it cannot be undone. The laugh that once humiliated me had lost its sting. Now it was only a memory, a spark that had ignited a fire he could no longer control. The first strategic move had been made, and it had landed with precision. They were afraid now, and fear would drive them into mistakes that would widen the cracks until nothing remained but rubble. The silence that once felt suffocating now felt liberating, because I knew it was no longer mine alone. I had an ally, I had the truth, and I had patience. That was all I needed. For in betrayal, the first cut is deep, but it is never the last. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew with unshakable certainty that soon, the man who once laughed at me would not be laughing at all. Once the first move had been made, once that single photograph had unsettled their fragile illusions and forced them into the uneasy dance of explanations and excuses, the real work began. Fear, when first introduced, is a spark. It startles, it flickers, it illuminates the cracks already there. But left alone, it can die down, and the betrayed can be persuaded back into sleep. To keep it alive, to grow it into something that consumes, it must be fed carefully, with precision, with the kind of relentless persistence that never allows them to feel safe again. And that is what we did. We became architects of their unease, curators of their dread, ensuring that every step they took was shadowed, every breath weighed down by the knowledge that they were not in control. It started small, almost imperceptible, the kind of pressure that could be mistaken for coincidence. A reservation mysteriously canceled at the last moment, leaving them stranded in a restaurant where the staff apologized for a system error. A bouquet of flowers delivered to her office with no sender's name, accompanied only by a card that read, "Does he know?" A receipt for 2 theater tickets printed and placed carefully where she could not ignore it, though she could not trace where it had come from. Each gesture was subtle, deniable, yet sharp enough to prick at the edges of their confidence. They looked over their shoulders more often. They spoke in whispers when they thought no one was listening. They began to carry with them the nervous energy of people waiting for the next blow. I could see it in him more clearly than anyone else, because he slept beside me. His phone never left his hand. Even when he showered, he placed it on the counter within reach, steam clouding the glass but never clouding his obsession. At night he tossed and turned, his body tense. The calm arrogance that once defined him now eroded into something closer to paranoia. He flinched when messages buzzed after midnight, clutching the device as though it might bite him. Sometimes I would pretend to stir, mumbling in half-sleep, and he would freeze, his thumb hovering over the screen, unsure if I had seen enough to piece together what he was so desperate to hide. He thought he was guarding himself, but in reality, he was betraying himself every second, his fear more revealing than any confession could ever be. She too was unraveling, though in different ways. My ally, the man she had promised loyalty to, told me how she had grown restless, her tone brittle, her eyes darting when she spoke of work. She had become defensive, overly affectionate in moments that didn't require it, trying to plaster over her guilt with smiles too wide, with kisses too frequent. He watched her in silence, just as I watched him, both of us becoming mirrors of each other, documenting every shift in their behavior. We exchanged updates like soldiers passing along reconnaissance, each detail another piece of evidence, another step toward their undoing. But the pressure was not just about the actions we orchestrated. It was about their own imaginations, the way fear metastasizes when left unspoken. They began to doubt each other, questioning alibis, dissecting words for hidden meaning. He would return home with his jaw tight, snapping at trivial things, his voice cracking at odd moments when he tried too hard to sound calm. She, according to her fiancé, had started to accuse him of being distant, of not believing her, planting seeds of discord in their fragile union. What they didn't realize was that every word they used against each other was precisely what we wanted. The psychological pressure was not simply external. It was becoming internal, woven into the fabric of their own relationship, a parasite feeding off their lies. I remember one evening when he arrived at my apartment, his face pale, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink. He didn't speak at first, just stared into the glass as though the amber liquid might offer him clarity. When I asked gently what was wrong, he muttered something vague about work stress, about deadlines, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked to his phone every 30 seconds, waiting for a message that didn't come, or perhaps fearing the one that might. He held me tighter than usual that night, his embrace almost desperate, as though he were trying to anchor himself to a life that no longer existed. I let him hold me, let him think I was comfort, while inside I catalogued the tremor in his hands, the sweat on his brow, the crack in the armor of the man who once laughed so easily at the idea of marriage. The pressure built gradually, but steadily, like water filling a room, invisible at first until it reached their throats. There was no safe space left for them, no corner of their lives untouched by suspicion. Every meeting, every dinner, every whispered conversation carried the possibility of exposure. They became creatures of habit disrupted, flinching at shadows, unraveling under the weight of an enemy they could not see. That was the brilliance of it. They didn't know it was us. They didn't know how close we were, how carefully we watched. They only knew that something was wrong, and that knowledge itself was enough to rot their confidence from the inside out. By then, I no longer thought of myself as the girl who had once asked about marriage. That girl was gone, buried in the echo of his laugh. In her place stood someone sharper, calmer, someone who understood the power of patience. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to confront. I only needed to keep pressing, keep feeding the silence that gnawed at their certainty, until the two of them tore each other apart. The psychological pressure was no longer something I was building. It had become a living thing, growing stronger every day, and neither of them had the strength to withstand it for long. As I lay in bed one night, listening to his breathing hitch in uneasy sleep, I realized the transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer the man who had laughed at me. He was a shadow of himself, worn down by fear, consumed by doubt. And the best part was that he had done it to himself. All I had done was nudge the first domino. The rest was his own collapse. Pressure builds in silence, but its true power is only revealed when silence breaks in front of others. For weeks we had orchestrated the shadows, pulling strings that made them flinch, unravel, doubt each other in the secrecy of their private spaces. But fear contained to the dark is still manageable, still something they could deny to themselves when no one was watching. What they feared most, what their arrogance could not withstand, was exposure. It wasn't enough for them to know we saw the truth. They had to be seen by everyone else, their carefully curated identities shattered beneath the gaze of the very people whose respect they craved. And so, the time for subtlety ended. The time for revelation began. We chose the event carefully. It couldn't be too small, couldn't be too intimate. It had to be public enough that the humiliation carried weight, that the moment could not be swept away as misunderstanding or mistake. And fate, almost too conveniently, provided the perfect stage. A gathering organized by his company, a cocktail evening with colleagues, clients, and acquaintances. He had spoken of it weeks earlier, boasting about the deal he would close, the image he would project, the way he would shine. That word stuck with me, because I knew what he thought shining meant, standing in front of others with confidence, with charm, with the illusion of being untouchable. It was the same illusion he had used against me, the same one he thought hid his cowardice. I decided then that this would be the night his shine would dim forever. My ally and I prepared with meticulous care. We sifted through our collection of evidence, selecting not everything at once but just enough to devastate. Screenshots of messages dripping with intimacy that couldn't be explained away as friendship. Reservations under false pretenses. Photos where hands lingered too long, where eyes betrayed desire. Each piece was a weapon, but together, they formed a symphony of destruction. Timing would matter most. Too early, and they could recover. Too late, and the impact would dull. The exposure had to land when their confidence was at its peak, when their laughter was loudest, so that the silence after would crush them completely. The night arrived with an air of inevitability. He dressed with unusual care, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, smoothing his shirt, rehearsing his smile. I watched from the doorway, my expression soft, my words encouraging, playing the role I had perfected, the loyal girlfriend at his side. Inside, my heart was cold steel. When he reached for my hand as we entered the venue, I let him hold it, even squeezed back, though all I felt was the weight of irony pressing between our palms. The room buzzed with conversation, glasses clinking, the hum of ambition woven through every laugh. He thrived in such spaces, leaning in with charm, speaking too loudly, ensuring his presence was noticed. She was there too, of course, her fiancé beside her, the very man who sat with me in silence weeks earlier, sharing his wounds, his eyes now carrying the fire of someone who knew exactly what was about to unfold. Our gazes met briefly across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the plan that bound us. He raised his glass slightly, not as a toast, but as a signal. We were ready. The moment itself came suddenly, yet felt like it had been building for years. The projector in the corner of the room, meant for a casual slideshow of company achievements, flickered to life. At first, the images were harmless. Graphs, smiling employees, shots of offices filled with productivity. Then, without warning, the sequence shifted. A photo of them together appeared on the screen. Not obscene, not vulgar, but undeniable. Their hands clasped in a way that left no room for innocence. Laughter in the room faltered. The chatter dimmed. Another photo followed. Then another. Screenshots of messages appeared next. The words too intimate, too suggestive to be mistaken for anything else. Gasps punctured the silence. Heads turned. Whispers darted across the room like sparks catching dry grass. I didn't need to look at him to know his face had drained of color. Didn't need to hear her breath to know it had caught in her throat. The room was their jury now, and every shifting gaze was a verdict. She reached instinctively for her fiancé's arm, but he stepped back, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. He didn't need to say anything. His rejection was louder than words. My boyfriend tried to stammer something, a half-formed excuse, but the weight of the evidence left his voice brittle. Laughter, his weapon of choice, was gone now, replaced by silence that spread through the room like a contagion. I stood calmly at his side, my face serene, as though I too were witnessing this revelation for the first time. But inside, I savored the collapse. It wasn't the exposure itself that satisfied me most, but the way it shattered their armor. They had believed they controlled the narrative, believed they could weave lies strong enough to contain us. But lies are fragile things when dragged into the light. And now, in front of everyone whose opinion they valued, their masks had slipped completely. When the screen went dark, the silence lingered heavy, broken only by the scrape of glasses being set down, by the shuffle of feet as people stepped away from them, as though betrayal itself were contagious. They were isolated, exposed, stripped of the illusion of respectability. She turned to him, eyes wide with blame, her lips moving in frantic accusation. He turned on her with equal fury, his voice cracking in whispers I could not hear but could easily imagine. Denials, justifications, anger. And then, like a final blow, her fiancé walked out without a word, leaving her standing alone in the circle of a crowd that had already begun to judge. For me, the night was not about spectacle. It was about balance, about reclaiming the dignity they thought they could strip from us with laughter and lies. Watching them squirm under the weight of exposure, I felt no pity, no guilt, only the steady calm of justice delivered. This was not the end, not yet. The game was still unfolding, but it was the moment that shifted everything. They could no longer hide. Their betrayal was no longer private. It belonged to everyone now. And as I sipped from my glass, my eyes meeting my allies across the room, I knew we had only just begun. The social exposure was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of the end. Exposure is a blade that cuts outward, but the deepest wounds are always the ones inflicted from within. Once their masks had been torn away, once the truth was no longer theirs to manage but instead property of every whispering tongue in that room, the collapse began. Not in a sudden explosion, but in the slow, inevitable disintegration of a structure that had already been rotten at its core. It was almost beautiful to witness, if beauty can exist in the destruction of arrogance, if justice itself can be called beautiful. For days after that night, they tried to patch the cracks with frantic hands, but the fractures only widened, spreading across every surface of their lives until there was nothing left to hold. I watched him unravel with a kind of cold fascination. The man who once laughed at me with careless cruelty now walked with a tension that made his shoulders curl inward, as if he could fold himself small enough to escape the stares he imagined followed him everywhere. At home, he was restless, pacing, snapping at minor inconveniences, drinking more than he had before, his voice growing sharp in moments that once would have passed unnoticed. He avoided my eyes, as though he feared seeing in them the reflection of what he had become. And when he did meet my gaze, it was fleeting, darting away like a guilty child caught in the act. Nights became restless vigils. He slept in fragments, muttering in dreams, waking drenched in sweat. His phone remained glued to him, but now it was not a weapon of secrecy. It was a shield he clung to desperately, though it could no longer protect him from the world's judgment. She was unraveling too, according to her fiancé. No, her ex-fiancé now, for he had severed his ties with the kind of quiet finality that leaves no room for negotiation. He told me in clipped messages how she begged, how she cried, how she tried to explain the unexplainable, her words spiraling into contradictions that only deepened her guilt. She lashed out at him one moment, pleaded for forgiveness the next, but the cycle was transparent, pitiful. The ring she once displayed so proudly was gone from her finger, and in its absence, her confidence drained like water from a broken vessel. She began to blame my boyfriend openly, her desperation spilling into accusations, each one sharper, crueler, until the alliance between them, the false foundation of lust and arrogance, began to rot in earnest. I remember the first time he broke in front of me. It was a Thursday evening, the apartment heavy with silence, the kind that seems to press against the walls until it feels suffocating. He had been drinking, his hands trembling slightly as he set the glass down too hard on the table. He looked at me then, his eyes bloodshot, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, he laughed. Not the cruel laugh I remembered, not the one that started all of this, but a hollow, broken laugh that cracked into sobs halfway through. He dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking, and for the first time I saw him as he truly was. Not powerful, not untouchable, not clever, but small, weak, and afraid. He whispered fragments, half-confessions tangled with excuses, words like mistake and pressure spilling into the air, but I let them hang unanswered. I did not comfort him. I did not rage. I simply watched, memorizing the image of his collapse, storing it alongside every shard of memory he had given me. The beauty of breakdown is that it needs no assistance once it begins. Left to themselves, they tore at each other with claws dulled by desperation. Their messages grew frantic, their meetings turned into arguments, their alliance collapsing into blame. He accused her of being reckless, of letting herself be seen. She accused him of cowardice, of failing to protect her. Each word they threw was another brick pulled from the crumbling wall between them and the ruin they had built together. The passion that once bound them rotted into contempt, and that contempt was louder than any truth I could have revealed. They did the work for me, dismantling their own illusion until there was nothing left but bitterness. I could see it spreading outward, too, into his work, his friendships, the very circles he once ruled with charm. Invitations grew fewer. Colleagues avoided him. His laughter, The weapon he once used so freely died in his throat when conversations fell quiet as he approached. The image of respectability he had built was shattered, not by my hand directly, but by the truth he himself had sown. That was the true justice. Watching him destroy himself piece by piece without me needing to raise my voice. At night, when he thought I slept, I would hear him whispering into his phone, his words choked with anger, desperation, fear. He begged her one moment, threatened her the next. The contradictions of a man who no longer knew where his power lay. She gave as good as she got, spitting venom in return, blaming him for everything, even for the life she had chosen to betray. They devoured each other in the dark, and I lay there, silent, my eyes closed, listening as the ruin deepened. Each whisper, each sob, each shout was another stone pulled from the structure of their deceit. What struck me most was how quickly strength dissolves when it was never real to begin with. The man who once believed he was untouchable now stood on shaking ground, his arrogance stripped, his dignity eroded, his confidence a shadow of itself. And she, who once smiled for cameras with a ring on her finger and the certainty of a future, now clawed at the remnants of a life that no longer wanted her. They had thought themselves clever, but in the end, their cleverness turned on them, leaving them nothing but hollow shells of what they pretended to be. The breakdown was not loud, not dramatic in the way films portray betrayal. It was quieter, more devastating. It was the sound of lies collapsing under their own weight, the slow crumble of foundations built on arrogance. It was the sight of two people realizing, too late, that the world they had mocked, the trust they had discarded, the laughter they had weaponized had all turned into weapons pointed back at them. And I, who had once been the object of their arrogance, stood untouched, steady, patient, watching as everything they valued slipped through their fingers. By the time he looked at me again, truly looked at me, his eyes hollow and his voice shaking, the man I had once loved no longer existed. All that remained was a fragment, a shell, begging silently for salvation I had no intention of giving. He thought the breakdown was temporary, something he could crawl out of with time. He didn't yet understand that this was only the prelude. The true end was still to come, and when it did, there would be nothing left of the man who laughed at me. The collapse of their fragile empire was not the end, but the beginning of something new, something that belonged entirely to me. Watching them destroy themselves was satisfying in its way, but vengeance alone is a hollow feast. What truly mattered was what came after. The rebuilding, the freedom, the quiet realization that the weight I had carried for so long had been lifted, not because they gave it back to me, but because I chose to set it down. Liberation was not a single moment of triumph, but a slow unfolding, like the dawn after a long and sleepless night, each ray of light peeling away the darkness until the world was visible again. I began to see the world differently, in small, almost imperceptible ways at first. The mornings were quieter, not heavy with the dread of what excuse he might spin that day, or what lie I would pretend not to notice. The coffee tasted stronger, sharper, as though my senses had been dulled for months and were now awakening. I walked through my apartment and felt, for the first time in too long, that it was mine alone, untouched by his restless energy, no longer haunted by the smell of his cologne or the echo of his laugh. Liberation does not roar. It whispers. It whispers in the absence of fear, in the silence of a phone that no longer holds secrets, in the lightness of air when it is no longer thick with deceit. He tried, for a while, to cling to me in his unraveling, as though I could be the rope that pulled him from the pit he had dug with his own hands. He spoke words he had never spoken before, promises, apologies, half-hearted declarations of love that dripped with desperation. Once, those words might have shattered me, might have bent me back into the shape of the woman who had asked about marriage only to be mocked. But now they meant nothing. I had already stepped beyond him, already chosen to place my life outside of the cage he had built. His pleas were echoes bouncing off walls I no longer lived within. The man who laughed at me was gone, but so too was the woman who had once been wounded by that laugh. There was no confrontation, no dramatic scene where I screamed my final truth into his face. That would have given him too much, made him believe he still held the power to draw emotion from me. Instead, I chose silence as my final act. I packed what little of mine had ever been in his space and left without ceremony, without note. I deleted his messages without reading them, blocked his calls, erased his presence from the fragile digital spaces where he might try to linger. And when I closed the door on him, truly closed it, I felt no need to look back. Liberation is not about fire and destruction. It is about walking away untouched, while the fire consumes everything behind you. What surprised me most was how quickly the heaviness faded once I allowed it. For weeks I had carried suspicion, anger, bitterness like stones in my chest. And then, as if by some quiet alchemy, they turned to dust and blew away. I found laughter again, not the cruel laughter he once used as a weapon, but genuine laughter, soft and light, spilling out in moments when I least expected it. I found space for myself, space to breathe, to dream, to think of a future that was not dictated by his moods or shadowed by his betrayals. The scars remained, of course. They always do. But they no longer stung. They were reminders, not chains. I met with my ally one last time, not in secrecy or tension, but in calm, as two people who had walked through fire together and emerged on the other side. We didn't speak of them much anymore. Their names had lost power. Their faces had lost weight. We spoke instead of what came next, of how strange it felt to step into freedom after so long spent suffocating. There was no romance in it, no forced intimacy, only recognition, respect, the quiet understanding that we had stood shoulder to shoulder in the storm and had not been broken. We parted with a handshake, a lingering glance, and the knowledge that neither of us needed to look back again. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild, not dramatically, not with sweeping gestures, but with the quiet steadiness of someone planting seeds after a long winter. I returned to the things I had once loved, the hobbies I had abandoned, the friends I had neglected. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not the woman he had diminished with laughter, but someone sharper, stronger, someone who had walked into betrayal and emerged unbowed. Liberation is not about forgetting the past. It is about refusing to let it dictate the future. Sometimes, late at night, I would remember that evening on the couch when I first asked about marriage, when his laugh cut me to the bone. I would remember how small I felt, how foolish, how naive, and then I would smile, not with bitterness, but with quiet pride, because that laugh had been the beginning of his end, and the beginning of my awakening. What he meant as cruelty became my catalyst. What he meant to diminish me instead carved the space for me to grow. He laughed, and in doing so, he set me free. In the end, liberation was not about revenge, though revenge played its part. It was not about watching him collapse, though I had watched. It was about reclaiming myself from the shadows he had cast, about stepping into a life where his voice no longer echoed. I carried nothing of him with me, not his promises, not his betrayals, not even his name. What I carried instead was the certainty that I was stronger than he ever believed, stronger than I had once believed myself to be. And as the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, I felt the truth settle deep in my bones. Liberation is not the absence of pain, but the presence of self, and I was finally, wholly, irrevocably mine.